Okay, good morning. We finally got the thing going, up and going, and we're going to Maine this morning, so either we're very rich or we like to be outdoors. There's no in between there. Actually, Maine is a beautiful state, and been up there. I used to, when I was on cruise ships, go up there every year, and we'd end up in Bar Harbor, and we'd end up in Acadia National Park, and we end up in Portland, which is now a foodie town. There are a lot of restaurants in Portland. But Maine is an interesting place, and it's pretty much forgotten in the history books because there was almost another war that started between England and the United States, a third war in 1839 there. It's a state that abolitionists were there. It's a state that was a dry state, a state where Prohibition actually started. The present day Maine started out as a province of the Massachusetts colony in 1677. The Crown said, "This part of North America is yours, Massachusetts," even though it's not connected to Massachusetts. There's a 10-mile gap between Massachusetts and Maine. Even though it was all the same state, that gap is New Hampshire, and there's Hampton Beach over in New Hampshire, which is actually quite nice. It becomes a state on March 15, 1820, and it has a place in American history because of the Missouri Compromise. Maine officially broke up with the Bay State on March 15th, and it became a state on its own and no longer part of Massachusetts, and they said, "We don't like those Boston people, so we're very happy to be our own state." So the people who lived in northern Massachusetts are now out on their own. And if you go to Maine, you see things like this, sailboats and cruise ships, among other things. Mainers wanted their own statehood after the American Revolution. Maine was a district of Massachusetts. And before the Revolution, not many people lived there, maybe 10,000, and they were all down around southern coastal cities, and they were in the shipping business and in the trade business. They were Massachusetts after all. Their place in history, in American history, is solidly cemented. Missouri Compromise of 1820, remember that? No, you don't? Then you flunked 5th grade social studies. Mrs. Greenblatt was my 5th grade teacher at PS 151 in Woodside, and she said, "You have all this knowledge, don't you?" I said, "It's all useless. It'll never serve me any purpose." But I guess it's going to serve me a purpose today. Maine struggled to free itself from Massachusetts, and the question of statehood suddenly and unexpectedly became entangled with the thorny issue of slavery. Because in the United States in 1820, there were an equal number of free states and slave states, and this was a problem. The people of Maine were abolitionists, and they found themselves in the odd position of opposing the very bill that would give them what they had sought for so long, statehood. They wanted to make sure there was an even number of states who were free and not free. And there's another picture of Maine that's up near Portland. Maine's constitution at the time, 1820, was very progressive. State leaders included protections for religious freedom, eliminated property ownership as a precondition to voting. I don't know if you know this or not, but the only people who could vote after the American Revolution and for quite a bit afterwards were people who owned property. If you didn't own property, you could not vote. So that was kind of interesting in Maine. And they also allowed black men the right to vote. No women, because, well, in the 19th century, women had less rights than a man in an insane asylum. You could look that up. The legislature, the Maine legislature, submitted its petition to statehood, for statehood, to the U.S. Congress, December 1819. But its bid played into a political context that extended well beyond New England. Maine becomes the 23rd state as part of the Missouri Compromise, which aimed to maintain the balance of free and slave states in the country. Maine is admitted as a free state. Missouri comes in as a slave state. But the compromise also said there would be no additional slavery, or you can't have slaves above the 3630 latitude line above Missouri. So Maine becomes a state, and it is an important, pivotal part of American history as the Missouri Compromise is part of it. That's the Maine seacoast, and it's actually quite nice in the summer, maybe not so in the winter. Maine is known for its summer homes, and it was the playground for the rich, the elite of society, and the rugged coastline. People like John D. Rockefeller were there. How many New York Mets fans are here? Well, Mets fans. Mrs. Payson, Joan Payson, was the original owner. Well, she spent her summers up in Maine because she was a blue blood and had a lot of money. Maine's a product of the Ice Age, the last glacier responsible for cutting what had been a relatively straight coastline into the hundreds of bays and inlets and harbors we know today. The receding ice sheet formed about 2,000 or so islands found off the Maine coast, including Bar Harbor. Discovery and colonization, that's Bar Harbor, as a matter of fact. 500 years before Columbus, you know Columbus discovered America, right? Yeah, you do know that. In 1492, he discovered, except he never set foot on what is now mainland United States, or North America. He's in the Caribbean islands, but Columbus discovered America. Anyway, Leif Erikson and a crew of 30 Viking sailors about 5 centuries before Columbus were believed to have explored the Maine coast, may have landed, may have tried to establish a settlement. We know that they were up in Newfoundland because they found some relics from Leif Erikson and the Vikings' expeditions. First settlement was established by the Plymouth Company in Popham, 1607, but they're kind of overshadowed by the Jamestown people. Why? Because they really didn't survive. They couldn't put up with the Maine winters. A number of English establishments were established along the Maine coastline in the 1620s, although they didn't really survive too well either because of the climate and Indian attacks, because there were Native Americans who discovered North America long before Leif Erikson or Columbus. There is a connection with Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia initially, when it was Massachusetts, was right across the river before Nova Scotia was cut in half to become New Brunswick and before Massachusetts got out of Maine. The Nova Scotia connection. There really were no borders back in 1605. French colonists established the first permanent European settlement in the future Canada, first north of Florida at Port Royal, founding what would become known as Acadia. And of course there is Acadia National Park in Maine. Wars were common. There were causes for these wars, mainly because France and Britain hated one another and they went to war an awful lot. And there was also the control of fur trade in the colonies, particularly in the Great Lakes, and the balance of power in Europe. So England or France, what's it for this place called Maine, which by the way is a French name? Well, England and France fought over it. The question of Maine's ownership was a matter of continuing dispute between England and France throughout the first half of the 18th century. It was a period marked by a series of Indian raids on white settlements, forays which had the active support of the French interested in seeing the English settlers driven from the land. During the War of the Spanish Succession, I'm going to go through a whole bunch of wars. There were a whole bunch of wars in the 18th century. From 1701 to 1714, the British captured Port Royal, the capital of the colony, in a siege. 1713, Treaty of Utrecht. Anybody go to Utrecht High School in Brooklyn? Now, did you know what it was? Wow, Utrecht was a high school there. Anyway, concluded the conflict and gave the colony to Great Britain, allowing the Acadians to keep their lands. Acadians now are the Cajuns. That is Louisbourg. That is Nova Scotia. That is outside of Sydney, Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. Over the next 40 years, the Acadians said, yeah, you know what? We have no alliance to Britain, and no allegiance to Britain. And Britain didn't like that. Here are all the wars that took place in that area. King William's War, 1688 to 1697. Queen Anne's War, they were all in the name of the king and the queen. 1702 to 1713. Father Rale's War, 1722 to 1725. King George's War, 1744 to 1748. Father Lee Latour's War, 1749 to 1755. And then finally, the 7 Years' War, which was touched off by George Washington because he was kind of incompetent on the battlefield. And that war started in 1756, 2 years after Washington got involved with the French, and there were all kind of ambushes and all that. Oh, that's the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes is part of what was going on. This is up in Sault Ste. Marie. King William's War was fought in the New World areas of the Great Lakes, northern New England, upper New York, the Ohio Valley, and the southern frontier. And the main result of this war was that the French had moved down the Mississippi to New Orleans, built forts along the way, and claimed the land. Queen Anne and King George's Wars dealt with the Spanish and Austrian successions to the thrones respectively. The areas of fighting, the southern frontier, Quebec, St. Lawrence River, Lake Champlain, Queen Anne's War. And in the King George's War, the fighting was the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes, and Nova Scotia. Somehow, the Rock of Gibraltar is involved in this thing because it changed hands. And ever been to the Rock of Gibraltar? Anybody ever been? Yeah? Did you see the monkeys pickpocketing people? The monkeys were really good. They're real fast at pickpocketing people. They don't arrest them. I don't understand. I think they share it with the people, the local police. But it's watching. They're bold. They'll do it right in front of you. They'll pickpocket you. Anyway, the results of these wars. Well, Britain gained the possessions from France in the New World and from Spain to get Gibraltar. And this is Louisbourg, which was the biggest fort in North America at one point. 1730, French finished building the military fortress, which would fall in 1758. The British would capture it and demolish it. The British are on a roll here because they get Quebec City as well. During the 7 Years' War, 1759, the British, under the command of General James Wolfe, besieged Quebec City for 3 months. And that is a picture from the top of the Quebec City, the upper village. And if you look down at there, you kind of figure there'd be no troops that want to climb up the cliffs to invade, right? Wrong. The city was defended by the French general, Marquis de Montcalm. Now, how many of you have been to Quebec City? Anybody? You know there are all walls there. There are walls, but the walls kind of ain't. And the French figured there's no way, absolutely no way, any of the British are going to climb up those cliffs. They're 250, 275 feet. Yeah, I can come. Well, they did. The city defended by the French general Montcalm. There's a battle on the plains of Abraham, which is Abraham's farm. And 15 minutes, the British take over. Montcalm is killed. And it's the surrender of Quebec. And there is the plains of Abraham, and behind there, the Frontenac, Chateau Frontenac. The British and French had coexisted in North America, but the threat of French expansionism into the Ohio Valley caused the British to attempt to eradicate New France completely from the map. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Quebec City is permanently lost by the French. There's the lighthouse in Louisbourg. Well, the French concede and they give up their claims to Canada. And Quebec City, the French-speaking Catholic population, became under the rule of the Protestant Brits. Britain goes home. War is done. It's done. The start of the United States can be traced to the fall of Quebec City. But the British did something else during these years over in Nova Scotia, which was kind of part of Maine. Anybody read Longfellow's Evangeline? Now, Longfellow was from Maine. Yeah, Evangeline. You didn't read that in school? It's all about Acadia. Anyway, in fact, he wasn't the one who was supposed to write it. Somebody else started writing and said, great. Hey, Longfellow, you want to write this? Yeah, sure. And Longfellow wrote it. Well, every young, back in the day, when I went to elementary school, young American elementary school students are introduced to Canada by this poem. Evangeline, A Tale of Acadia, is a poem by the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, published in 1847. And the poem follows an Acadian girl by the name of Evangeline in her search for her lost love Gabriel, set during the time of the expulsion of the Acadians. Let's get this straight. It was ethnic cleansing of the French by the English. That's what it was. Well, it was the forced removal of the British people of by the British of the Acadian people, French, from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, all parts of an area known as Acadia. Some of the Acadians ended up in Louisiana and formed American Cajun culture. During the expulsion, during the French and Indian War, there were 14,100 Acadians in the region. About 11,500 Acadians were deported. Some ended up in what is now known as Maine. And you go to Maine and there are a lot of French names that live in Maine. That was George's Island. If you, that's in the harbor in Halifax. If you survived that, chances are you were going to survive it. But if you did, the English would put you on boats and you would go off to various places, including the Louisiana Purchase. You were Louisiana Territory because you were French citizen. Some of them ended up in northern Maine. During the 7 Years' War, 2,000 French sailors were imprisoned on the island after the British victory in the Battle of Cape Race, Newfoundland. Fort Charlotte was one of the 4 ports where Acadians were imprisoned over the 9 years of the expulsion of the Acadians. According to the historian Ronnie Gilles Leblanc, there were about 1,600 Acadians held prisoner on that island. 600 at a time. You died, or you got off there. Chances are you were going to die. We're sorry now. You go through Halifax downtown, the waterfront in Halifax, and they got all these little things saying, "We're sorry, we didn't mean to do this." And that one is the expo where they got rid of all the ethnic cleansing thing, where the ones who survived ended up. The result of the expulsion was the devastation of the primary civilian population and the economy of the regions. Thousands of Acadians died, mainly from diseases, or they were drowned on the ships. But it's all over. Treaty of Paris, 1763. And Britain pretty much has control of Nova Scotia, Quebec, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, not Vermont, because there was no such thing as Vermont in those days, and the 13 colonies that were set up. The Treaty of Paris ends the French and Indian War. Great Britain is not engaged in the war for the first time in about 50 years. And somebody in Great Britain says, we got to pay for this. How are we going to pay for this? I know some rich people in our colonies. We're going to raise taxes on them. French and Indian War aftermath, well, let's go tax John Hancock. Let's go tax those people in Massachusetts. In the South, now the South is, here's Nova Scotia, here's the water, and here's Massachusetts. The South is the Massachusetts colony, just south of Nova Scotia. They know England has won the war in Quebec and chased the French from Nova Scotia. So what's next? Well, what's next is the proclamation of 1763. And you can see here are the 13 southern colonies, even though Quebec Quebec is south of Maine, or Massachusetts in those days. So we're going to take care of these people. The first thing we're going to do, you can't go past the Appalachian Mountains. You're stuck in these colonies. And that is resented in Virginia. The resentment starts. Patrick Henry. Remember Patrick Henry? Give me liberty. Okay, Patrick Henry. Parliament, 1765, imposes the Stamp Act for taxing the American colonies. And Patrick Henry introduces the Stamp Act resolves in the Virginia House of Burgesses. These resolves challenge Britain's right to impose a tax. And up in Massachusetts, this is now Portland, it was Falmouth back then, they're upset. Resistance to the oppressive colonial taxes by the British Parliament began early in Maine, part of Massachusetts. 1765, a mob seized a quantity of tax stamps at Falmouth, now Portland, and the tax on custom agents in the province became common. Remember, they're part of Massachusetts, and remember, there's that Boston Tea Party. And by the way, if you go to Boston and you want to recreate the Tea Party, for $10, you go in that building, they'll give you some tea, you can throw it into the river, and you can say, hey, I'm part of the Tea Party. That was part of the Tea Party today. Seeking to boost the troubled East Indian Company, British Parliament adjusted import duties. Consignees in Charlestown, South Carolina, New York and Philadelphia said, no, we don't want it, we don't want it. But the merchants in Boston said, okay, we'll take it. And this starts the Boston Tea Party. But this is not the only Tea Party in Massachusetts. This is merely the first. On the night of December 16, 1773, Samuel Adams led the protest, but he wasn't going to go on the ship. He's not going to risk his life. Samuel Adams used to talk to the sky in front of the cemetery in Boston. He would talk to the sky, but he's the leader, right? 60 members of the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 ships in the Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of teas overboard. It resulted in the coercive acts, which actually impacted Maine, people in what became Maine. Well, you know what? We got to punish. The king said, King George III, got to punish the Massachusetts colony, and Boston in particular, because of the Tea Party and the pattern of resistance. And up in what is now Maine, the people living there, they paid the price too. Boston Harbor was closed until the lost tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Constitution ended, so there's no more free elections of town officials. And the judicial authority goes to Britain and British judges, creating martial law in Massachusetts and now what is Maine. The colonists had to put up British troops on demand and extended freedom of worship to French Canadian Catholics under British rule, and that angered the Protestant colonists. This is a tea party that you've never heard of. The York Tea Party. Did you ever hear of the York Tea Party? This is in Massachusetts, or Maine, and there they are. A year after the Boston Tea Party, York's Tea Party, September 15th, 1774, that happened. And it was rather small, but it was symbolic in the backwater of New England. York's Tea Party was not an isolated incident. Other tea protests erupted through the colonies during the same period. Some were small, like York, some were large, like Boston. Regardless of the size, these far-reaching protests served to demonstrate the growing resistance to English rule and the American Revolution. The end, 1781, the Americans, with the assistance from France, beat England in Yorktown, Virginia. The surrender of Cornwallis, Yorktown. Doesn't make King George III very happy. He's not very happy at all. America is lost. America is lost. Well, King George is reluctant to come to terms about this after the Battle of Yorktown, 1781. He's ready to quit, but then he remembered, it's good to be the king. So he didn't. So he said, hey, bureaucrats, politicians, do what you want. Do what you want. I'm going to sulk here. Do what you want. Get the peace negotiations done. And the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States, and somehow Florida gets ceded to Spain. Well, you know, cut it off. So is what they did. Anyway, so the war is over, and, well, Massachusetts is back to kind of normal. The revolution cost Maine dearly. 1,000 men, not too many people living there, 1,000 men are dead. The district, C district, was destroyed, and the principal city of Falmouth, which became Portland, had been leveled by British bombardment. These people are beginning to say, hey, we don't like those people in Boston. We don't like that state capital. We just don't like them. Following the Revolutionary War, frontier settlers who resented the rule from Boston said, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of here. Coastal merchants who held the balance of power at the time resisted the separation. We can stay with Massachusetts because we got the money. You don't. But the War of 1812 comes around, and Massachusetts, or the people in Boston, are saying, nobody lives there. They were unwilling and unable to provide adequate protection for the people of the district against British raids. War of 1812, meaningless war. I mean, people died, and basically they died for nothing. The War of 1812, the United States declared war against Great Britain in reaction to three things. British economic blockade of France, the impressment of thousands of neutral American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will, and the British support of Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. The United States is 36 years old. Hey, they're middle-aged men, right? And they declare war for a second time against Great Britain. There was a plan here. Conquer what is now Canada, all that land up there, and take North America for the United States. Manifest destiny, all that, although manifest destiny comes years later. We want the whole continent. Maybe not Mexico, but we want this part of the continent. But it never happened. Albert Gallatin is the U.S. envoy. On December 24th, 1814, there is an agreement, the Treaty of Ghent, and it's back to the 1812 borders. You know, that's it. We're going back to where we started. Britain gives up American land near the border, Great Lakes, and the U.S. gives up Ontario and returns land to Spain. Florida land back to Spain. Florida's always in play. James Madison, the president, signs an agreement on February 17, 1815, ending the war, except nobody told him. Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. Old Hickory said we could take him by surprise. News of the treaty took almost 2 months to cross the Atlantic, and British troops weren't informed of the end of hostilities in time to end their drive against the mouth of the Mississippi River. On January 18, 1815, a large British army attacked New Orleans that was decimated by an inferior American force under General Andrew Jackson in the most spectacular U.S. victory of the war, which was meaningless because the war was over. But it was good for one person, this guy. Remember Johnny Horton? No? 1959, the Battle of New Orleans. In 1814, we took a little trip down the mighty Mississippi. You don't remember that song? It was a big hit for Johnny Horton, who also had North to Alaska, which is part of the James Polk talk. Delegates met for 3 weeks in October of 1819 in Maine, and they meet in Portland, which is now the capital. It's newly named, to hammer out a state constitution. A document strongly rooted in political independence, religious freedom, and popular control of the government. The president of the convention was William King, a prominent Bath merchant, Bath, Maine, and shipbuilder who subsequently became Maine's first governor. And here it is, its statehood, and that's Portland statute. With popular sentiment unified behind statehood, the separation movement went forward. Congress established Maine as the 23rd state under the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Maybe you heard about the Underground Railroad. Know about the Underground Railroad? Yeah, okay. Well, Portland was a stop on the Underground Railroad. It was called the Portland Freedom Trail. This state was an anti-slavery state. They had a strong anti-slavery tradition. Maine organized anti-slavery, or its organized anti-slavery efforts begin in earnest in 1833 with the formation of the Maine Anti-Slavery Society. And you see these little plaques throughout Portland. A secondhand clothing store, Lloyd Scott, 44 Exchange Street. Scott became the vice president of the Portland Union Anti-Slavery Society in 1842. And it was a stop. You got your stuff, and you could go up to Nova Scotia if you wanted to do that, or stay there, the Underground Railroad. Maine played an important role in one of the most important movements for African Americans seeking freedom from slavery, the Underground Railroad. From Portland to Brunswick, Topsham to Brewer to Fort Kent, sympathetic whites and freed blacks created some 75 safe houses along the route. They risked their own lives to provide a hiding place in homes or businesses for escaping slaves, most of whom were headed to Nova Scotia, and some ended up in Ontario. The Obsidian Meeting House in Portland became a safe haven for runaway slaves. They found support from both blacks and whites. It also served as a conduit in shielding runaway slaves from the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 required that slaves be returned to their owners even if they were in a free state. The act also made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying to escape slaves. How many of you read Uncle Tom's Cabin or are familiar with it? It was written in Maine. It was written in Maine. Encouraged by her sister-in-law, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wife of a Bodine, college professor, wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in Brunswick. First published as a series in 1851, first appeared as a book the following year. The heart-wrenching tale portrays slave families forced to cope with separation by masters through sale. It sold 300,000 copies in the North alone. Oh, speaking of book banning, did you see the Bible has been banned in one school district in Utah? Oh yeah, it happened the other day because it's got too much violence and too much porn. You know, I heard about the Bible having porn from the Gene Shepherd show back on WOR radio when I was like 14 years old, and I listened to Shep every night at 10 o'clock, and he talked about it. So that book, the Bible's been banned in one school district in Utah. There are all kinds of book bannings going on today. We have a long tradition in the United States of banning books, right? Including Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was adapted for the theater multiple times beginning in 1852 because the novel made use of themes and techniques of theatrical melodrama popular at the time. Its transition to the stage was rather easy, and there is Stowe. When the author of the novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, visited Abe Lincoln at the White House in December 1862, Lincoln reportedly greeting her by saying, "Is this the little woman who made this great war?" The publication of the novel was, of course, one of many events during the decade of the 1850s that put the country on the course to civil war. So you know about the 1839 possible war between Britain and the United States? No? Never learned about that in school? Neither did I, until I went up there. This is St. John, New Brunswick, which is right across the water from Maine. Britain against America, third time? There was a northeast boundary dispute. The precise boundary line between Maine and New Brunswick remained a matter of often heated arguments for years after the close of the Revolutionary War. The dispute festered until 1839, when it threatened to erupt into open warfare. The Maine legislature that year raised funds to support a military force to protect the state's borders claims at Madawaska. Several hundred British regulars were dispatched to the scene from Quebec. At this point, U.S. Congress entered the picture, and they said, hey, here's $10 million. Let's go to war. But cooler heads prevailed. Nearly 50,000 troops were ready for action, and Major General Winfred Scott was dispatched to the scene. Scott worked out a temporary agreement between the two parties, and the so-called War of Aroostook reached the point of bloodshed before it happened. So cooler heads prevailed. 3 years later, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, Daniel Webster, Secretary of State, of 1842, settled a long-time feud with England over where Maine ended in British Canada, and the Brits ruled Canada began. War narrowly had been averted between the two nations on several occasions over border and incursion issues, and the treaty was instrumental in bettering diplomatic relations. It was a temporary solution that would be solved in 1846. Anybody hear of the Maine law? But anyway, before I go on, you don't have to answer this. Anybody like to have a little nip of alcohol once in a while? Anybody? Come on. I see the laughter, so I know some people occasionally, you know, for whatever purpose, like to have a little nip, right? Not Maine. Not Maine. The temperance movement had its origins in Maine. The world's first total abstinence society was founded in Portland in 1815. They were still part of Massachusetts. The Organization of Temperance Societies was formed in 1834, and within a dozen years had developed enough political clout to force the enactment of a state law prohibiting the sale of alcoholic spirits except for medicinal and mechanical purposes. Wait, if you were working on something like an engine or something, you could drink? Is that what it meant? Mechanical purposes? Portland's Neil Dow, known internationally as the father of Prohibition, led the way, and Maine approved a total ban on the manufacture and sale of liquor in 1851. Down in Boston, you've heard about Carrie Nation, right? Carrie Nation was like one of the leading she was one of the people who felt abstinence was the best thing in a lot of ways. Well, there's a bar in Boston called Carrie Nation, featuring Boston's first original speakeasy. And you go in there, and of course you get anything you want. Anyway, so the tradition started when Maine was part of Massachusetts. On January 19, 1919, Congress ratified the 18th Amendment, banning the manufacturing, sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages, something that in Maine, you know, they had the speedboats that went between New Brunswick and Maine. It was legal, and the projectionist at the drive-in movie that I worked at when I was 18 years old, 1974, Albert Morris. He was a Canadian citizen living in Rockland County, and they would send the stuff down to Suffern, New York on the train. He'd pick it up, take it to his bathtub, dilute it somewhat, go back, and put it westward. And I said to Al, I was 18 years old, I said, where'd it go once you got rid? I don't know. Did it go to Capone? I don't know, it just went west somewhere. That was 40 years later, he wouldn't talk about it. But anyway, with the Great Depression, by 1932, Roosevelt ran for president on a platform calling for the Prohibition's repeal, and he defeated Herbert Hoover, and Prohibition is over in February 1933. The 21st Amendment to the Constitution repealed the 18th Amendment. The amendment was submitted to states, and in December 1933, Utah of all places, provided the 36th and final necessary vote for ratification. The Maine law, though, remained in effect one form or another until the repeal of the national prohibition in 1934. Well, there's Maine. There's Maine again. Once Maine became a state, there was a period of tremendous economic growth, and mining and manufacturing industries emerged, as did lumberjacking. In fact, I'll give you a lumberjack story. Back about 28 years ago, Major League Baseball had a problem. They could not get enough guys from the Dominican and other Latin American countries into the country for the minor leagues, because you needed an H-1 visa, and H-1B visas didn't cut it. So Maine was having problems finding lumberjacks back in around the mid-1990s. So there was something worked out. Baseball supported a law to increase seasonal opportunities because Maine needed lumberjacks. And they passed the law, and all the lumberjacks came in from Quebec to do whatever they had to do in Maine, and Major League Baseball was able to get people like Mariano Rivera. Any Yankee fans here? No Yankee fans? Wow. Anyway, he didn't have the right visa, but because of the change in the seasonal workers law, he came in and he became a Hall of Fame pitcher. So there was lumbering, there was traditional fishing and shipbuilding, ice harvesting, granite and lime quarrying. They were important industries, and it also became the playground to the rich. That's me speaking at the George Bush Presidential Library. Your tax dollars at work, because you can imagine that? They spent your tax dollars on me to talk to, well, I was talking to 20 people, 20 college students about the politics of sports business. There were 3 from Russia, 3 from Venezuela, 3 from Indonesia, 3 from Nigeria, and there were 3 others, I forgot where the other 3, 1 Canadian and 4 Americans. Anyway, so they're there, and I'm talking to them, and I bring up the Bush Library because Bush, the compound, the summer White House was in Kennebunkport. So anyway, let's see, it was three Russians, 3 Indonesians, Turks, 3 Turks. So 3 Turks, 3 Russians, 3 Indonesians, 3 Nigerians, and it's your taxpayers who paid for me to speak there. So think of that. And you're still paying for me today, right? All these years later. Anyway, the Bush compound was the summer home of the 41st President of the United States, George H.W. Bush. It's located on Walker's Point. Walker's Point just juts out into the Atlantic Ocean in southern Maine. Oh, by the way, George H.W. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, it was the Walker family. Anyway, into the town of Kennebunkport. The property has been a family retreat for more than a century. And thank you, Mr. President. Those are the kids that This is 2007. They're not kids anymore. They're nearly 40 years old, some of them. Anyway, so thank you, Mr. President, for spending your money on me. The Bush compound. He was the Vice President of the United States between 1981 and 89. President between 89 and 93, and the people who went there, Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, John Major, the Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, the Israeli President, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, Gorbachev and Putin were there, along with the French President Nicolas Sarkozy. That is Bar Harbor, and that is where we are going to leave here, in Bar Harbor. So you can enjoy Bar Harbor with the rich people, like John D. Rockefeller. It's the playground of the rich. There were 30 hotels, including the Myra Monte Inn, a historic landmark, which would survive the massive fire that burnt down the town in 1947. Tourists arriving by train and ferry to the Gilded Age Resort that would rival Newport, Rhode Island. The rich and famous tried to outdo one another with entertaining and estates, hiring landscape gardeners and landscape architect Beatrice Farron, a resident at the local Reefport estate, to design their gardens. Some of the lifestyles you could see from the street Well, you know, shore path, a walkway skirting waterfront lawns, yachting, gardening parties at the Pot and Kettle Club, and carriage rides up Cadillac Mountain, popular diversions. And others joined horse racing at the Robin Hood Park, Morrell Park. And William Howard Taft, President of the United States, he went up there in 1910 to play golf at the Keebo Valley Golf Club. And this is Acadia National Park. You know who owned Acadia National Park before the government did?
Rockefeller.
John D. Rockefeller.
Yeah.
He owned it. He owned it. It became a national park during the Woodrow Wilson administration in 1919, and Rockefeller was responsible for the park design. John D. Rockefeller Jr., son of John D. Rockefeller of the Standard Oil Company, donated about 1/3 of the land, 11,000 acres in Acadia National Park, and built the carriage roads that are used for hiking and biking. There is a place in Westchester, the Rockefeller Preserve, that has the similar look in terms of the carriage roads. J.P. Morgan owned a house adjacent to Bar Harbor. Cornelius Vanderbilt built cottages in Bar Harbor. The Astor family owned hotels and cottages in Bar Harbor and the surrounding areas. This was October. It was a little chilly on top of Cadillac Mountain, but that's where the rich played during the summer. One of the most unique historic aspects of how Acadia National Park is formed was due to the vision and donations of private citizens like George B. Dorr and Charles W. Eliot, who anticipated that there would be dangers if there was overdevelopment, and they wanted to protect it. That's the Thunder Hole. And you walk by the Thunder Hole, every once in a while you'll hear a boom, boom, boom. Well, it's one of the smallest national parks in the United States. There's mountain, there's sea, there are lake vistas and craggy cliffs that plunge to the surface, and 125 miles of trails for hiking and biking. And then there is the 1,352-foot Cadillac Mountain and the Thunder Hole water spout. That is downtown Bar Harbor. And on a good day, you might have 3,000 tourists from cruise ships there. And on a good day, the locals don't want the 3,000 people from the cruise ships or more. In mid-1947 of October, Maine experienced a severe drought. Sparks at a cranberry bog near Town Hall ignited a wildfire that would intensify over 10 days and would not be declared out until mid-November. One of the several wildfires in the state that year. By the way, how was your air quality the last couple of days? Because there's been a wildfire in Nova Scotia that all the winds have come down here. And it was pretty bad last night where I live in Westchester, the air quality. Anyway, nearly half the east side of the Mount Desert Island burned, including 67 palatial houses on Millionaires Row. 5 historic grand hotels and 170 permanent homes were destroyed. 10,000 acres of Acadia National Park destroyed. The town's business district was spared, including the Mount Desert Historic District, which is listed on the National Registry of Historic Places, which operates as inns. Bar Harbor, nice place. Bar Harbor was a popular port and is a popular port for passenger ships, cruise ships, throughout the fall, somewhere between September 1st and about October 25th, which is the end of the season. But the number of visitors from the cruise ship regularly surpassed the number of people living in the town, and that's become a problem. An ordinance was passed in November 2021 that restricted the number of daily visitors from cruise ships to 1,000 a day, which means about 3,000 aren't going to get off the ship. It's not a good thing. Starting in 2024, the maximum limit of guests per day will be fully implemented. Local businesses are not happy because they can't sell sweatshirts. At the end of the season, you can get a great deal on sweatshirts, sweatpants, and hats, but they're not going to be able to do it. And so, we say goodbye to Maine and we sail off to somewhere else. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? Your turn.
Thank you.
Your turn. So you want to go to Maine?
Yeah, sure.
Sure.